Welcome to Meet the Candidates on Brattleboro Community Television. I'm your host, Chris Lenois, and today we're speaking with Deb Bucknam, the Republican candidate for Vermont Attorney General. Welcome, Deb.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Yeah, good to have you here. And Meet the Candidates, as we were saying just before we went on, very appropriate for you. You're probably relatively unknown down here in southern Vermont, but very well known up in the St. Johnsbury area, having your own private law practice there for over 30 years. You've chaired the GOP party in Caledonia County. You've also been vice chair of the Vermont Republican Party, but this is your first time seeking elected office. Just curious to know why now to get us started.
Well, that's a great question. But just to correct you slightly,
please.
I was town moderator for a few years.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
In Walden, the big metropolis. The reason I decided to run was I have been a small town lawyer in St. Johnsbury for 30 years, and I'm a trial lawyer. So I represent people in some form of crisis, and I represent individuals and small businesses. And over the years, I have seen my clients become more and more frustrated with Montpelier and dealing with the bureaucracy in Montpelier. I have practiced in every court in the state and also in front of administrative agencies and bodies. So I'm familiar with the problems that people have with the Montpelier bureaucracy. So that's one of the reasons I'm running. The other reason is, in my practice, I have seen the opioid epidemic just blossom, and blossom's probably not the right word, spread like a disease across our state. And it's a huge problem, and it's devastating our families. And I see that up front and personal with my clients. So those are the two major reasons I'm running.
Yeah, well, and both of those issues are at the top of your website, bucknam2016.com, if people want to go look at those issues themselves. Let's start with a little bit of that frustration with Montpelier administration. Even before you announced your candidacy for Attorney General, you had a couple of different op-eds critical of the outgoing Attorney General, William Sorrell. And back in January 2016, you talked about him chilling free speech rights in a complaint against anti-wind activists. How much of a factor was Bill Sorrell's tenure specifically in your decision to run?
Well, I think that was a factor. As you said, I did write a commentary about the Attorney General attempting to silence Annette Smith, who was simply helping people with the very complicated procedure involving industrial wind. And frankly, I represented a group of people in Newark, Vermont, who were opposed to the industrial wind site there. And I became aware through my representation how complicated the procedure is and how expensive it is if someone needs to hire a lawyer. So that Annette Smith is performing a great service for Vermonters who can't afford the expensive legal advice and counsel. So when I saw that the Attorney General was, at the behest of a large Burlington law firm, was going after Annette Smith, I was not happy, and
Right.
I wrote an op-ed.
Right, but it's bigger than just the Attorney General's office, it sounds like, as far as things that have cost you to run.
Right,
Yeah.
That's right. I have been involved, as I said, with administrative procedures and with people who are trying to get permits and trying to deal with the state in Chin's cases with DCF. So families are frustrated, as well as business people, frustrated with the way Montpelier treats them. Quite often they treat them very arrogant. They're fairly arrogant, and so Montpelier officials are supposed to be our public servants, not our public masters.
Right. Well, and you say on your website where you cast yourself in the Attorney General's role as the people's attorney and talk about this advocacy office, an ombudsman,
Right.
if you will, for this. And just curious, you just gave a couple of examples of complaints that people might be having with the bureaucracy in Montpelier. Has anybody done any studies? Do we know how big of a problem this is?
No, I haven't seen any studies, but I can tell you a couple of other examples. And here's one that's just so emblematic of the problem. On the Vermont government website, there is a link that says business. So you punch that link and you come to another page, and on that page there is a link that says permitting and compliance portal. And you punch that link and it goes back to the previous page. In other words, it goes nowhere.
Right.
And that is so symptomatic of the problems in Montpelier.
But why wouldn't, for that example in particular, I mean, couldn't that just be fixed by, hey, it's down, you need to get IT to fix that website? Why would a separate ombudsman need to get involved there?
Well, that's a great question. That particular link has been that way for a very long time. So if we had an ombudsman, someone could call us up and say, hey, I'm trying to learn what I need to do because I want to build a warehouse, and I go on the website and it goes nowhere. And we can call up the governor's office or whatever agency is involved, the IT people, and say, what's going on? Can you fix this? Sure, a Vermonter could do that too as well, but if you have someone else that says, I'm from the Attorney General's office, I think that can be more persuasive sometimes.
Yeah. Would there be recourse for people filing the complaints, or I don't know, actually the legal term, redress, or?
Well, not really. That's part of the problem. By law, the government is mostly not accountable or not liable for their actions. There's all kinds of layers of immunities with government actions. So our ombudsman program, we would have no legal authority to tell an agency what to do. But persuasive authority can be effective. There's a lot of really good people working for Vermont state government, and I think they want to do the right thing. I think they've had a lack of leadership and a lack of direction. And if we talk to them, and we're not going to scold them or anything like that, we're going to see if we can fix the problem. And I think when people start focusing on fixing the problem, I think things will change.
Yeah. How do you see that position getting filled? Is it just an appointment? Would the legislature have any oversight?
Well, as Attorney General, I can reorganize the Attorney General's office and assign attorneys and staff to different units. Now, the Vermont Attorney General's office has approximately the same number of attorneys in its office as the New Hampshire Attorney General. And of course, New Hampshire has twice the population. And I have also seen myself what I think is some wasted of resources in the Attorney General's office. For example, 6 or 8 weeks ago, we had filed a lawsuit against the state and asked for a preliminary injunction.
We being your private
my
firm.
client,
Okay,
yes, on behalf of my client. And when you ask for a preliminary injunction, the court is supposed to set it fairly soon. So they set the hearing, and the Attorney General did not receive the notice until the day before the hearing for a variety of reasons. But they did not receive the notice until the day before the hearing, and so they did not contact us when they got the notice, but they came to St. Johnsbury, and there were 2 lawyers. And the 2 lawyers came to St. Johnsbury to tell the court that they had not had time to respond to this motion for preliminary injunction. That's a waste of resources. So what my plan is to reorganize the Attorney General's office and staff this Citizens Protection Unit, this Small Business Protection Unit, with the staff that we already have.
Yeah. Well, and there was another phrase on your website that talked about redirecting resources to the Attorney General's office, and that made me wonder what you thought was being emphasized too much by the current Attorney General and his office, and what you would de-emphasize.
Well, I would de-emphasize the national lawsuits, the filing amicus briefs in national cases. I know this Vermont Attorney General's office has filed briefs. I think they filed the briefs in the gay marriage issue, and, for example. And yes, we may file amicus briefs when I think it's important, but I would have a tendency to de-emphasize that if we had issues regarding Vermonters' needs. That's what we're going to look at first.
Yeah. Oh, when you talk about some of the lawsuits, I think I remember coming back here and starting to learn a little bit more about the Attorney General's office. I grew up in Vermont, came back here, and realizing it's kind of a revenue source in some of these lawsuits thing. Is that something you don't think is appropriate for the role?
Well, I would have to analyze those cases, of course, and see what the cost and the benefit is of filing those cases and pursuing those cases. My inclination, again, would be to focus on Vermonters' needs rather than getting involved with these national lawsuits. Yes, they are revenue sources, but I really would want to look at the cost because I know the Vermont Attorney General's office has hired out-of-state law firms, and they are very expensive. So I want to look at that extremely carefully.
Yeah. Attorney General, only one of many vacancies at the top of the leadership in Montpelier this year. Kind of a blank slate coming in here. And for you, there's probably a pretty even chance you'd be working with a Republican governor, Phil Scott, or a Democratic governor in Sue Minter. How much should that matter to an Attorney General as far as whether you're working with a Republican or a Democrat?
Well, the Attorney General's office should really be bipartisan because we're the chief law enforcement officer of the state, and we deal with legal issues, not with policy. So I will be happy to work with either Phil Scott or Sue Minter on issues that are of mutual concern to the governor's office and the Attorney General's office.
Yeah, you've probably had interactions with both of them in your professional career.
Well, to tell you the truth, I have not met Sue Minter, but I do know Phil Scott quite well.
All right. Your opponent for the Democratic Party, TJ Donovan, somebody who has a high profile, having run for office before, being over there in Burlington, amassed a pretty formidable war chest for his campaign. Talk a little bit about not just the political issues, but just in terms of how you would operate as Attorney General differently than how you hear him saying he would operate.
Well, I think what I bring to the Attorney General's office is a background that's very different from TJ Donovan, and that is a background in private business, private practice. I've been practicing for 37 years, as I've indicated, and in the last 30 years, I've had my own business. I've never worked for the government in my professional career. So, and I also live in the Northeast Kingdom. So those two values, I think, is what I'm bringing to the Attorney General's office. For example, as I may have mentioned to you, in the opioid epidemic, combating that, we are going to form a task force immediately, right after I'm elected, and bring everybody together that's dealing with this particular issue. Law enforcement, the medical profession, education, business community, the recovery community. All these people, we're going to assess and inventory the programs, and we're going to help implement the programs that or encourage the programs that are working, implement programs that we think could work, and work with the other agencies to move forward. Now, I think what I bring to that is I am not going to form a task force to issue reports. I want to get things done because as a business person, you have to get things done or you go out of business. So I think that attitude or that value or that skill is something different than what TJ Donovan's experience has been. And as I said, I have represented individual Vermonters, thousands of them, as well as small businesses. So that's a view of life. I think it's quite different than someone who is in the the state's attorney's office.
Yeah. And I'm sure your experience in the St. Johnsbury courts, you've seen firsthand some of these ravages of the opioid epidemic that we have here in the state of Vermont. Obviously, it's pervading our community, all communities across the state. It was the subject of Governor Shumlin's State of the State a couple of years ago now, and he has changed the conversation a bit to take it away from being a law enforcement issue exclusively and being more treatment oriented. It sounds like your task force is kind of a similar idea. How do you see that? Do you see it as a complement to what is already in place?
Yes, really I do. My concern with Governor Shumlin's focus, though, is, as you said, his State of the Union address was actually almost 3 years ago. And he was perfectly right to do that. That was the right thing to do, to focus this issue. The problem has been that his administration is really focused almost exclusively on treatment and rehabilitation. And with any disease epidemic, you have treatment of the ill, but you have prevention so people don't get ill. And so prevention does include law enforcement. Because in order to reduce the use and stop the spread, ever since his State of the Union address, the disease continues to spread. You've got to stop the spread. So how do you do that? You make drugs more expensive and less accessible. That's what we did with the nicotine epidemic. If you remember, I remember very well, there was smoking everywhere. In fact, I remember even in the courts on Monday morning at arraignment day, it was blue with smoke when we went in there to represent our clients. So what happened in combating that epidemic, we did two things. We made it less accessible and more expensive, and we educated the public. How do you make drugs less accessible and more expensive? You have to do it with law enforcement. You have to make drug trafficking too risky for this state. We have to let the drug traffickers know that it is too risky to do business in Vermont. And so we need coordination between the different law enforcement agencies and the state's attorney's office and the attorney general's office and the U.S. attorney's office. And we need to look at the laws to see if we can tighten them up to make it easier to investigate and apprehend these traffickers. And we also need to monitor the prescription drug monitoring system that we have in place now. So there are a number of things that we can do to reduce that use and to prevent this disease from spreading.
I mean, yeah, you talk about the prescription drugs, and that's really where, at least the stories we're hearing down here, that's where a lot of it is beginning. People who get a prescription for a painkiller, and then that prescription runs out, insurance doesn't cover it anymore, they can't afford the drugs themselves, and so they look for the less expensive solutions, heroin or some of these other even more lethal concoctions that are coming out on the street. When you talk about making it easier to crack down on some of the crime and some of the trafficking of it here, do you have specific thoughts in mind on where laws can be strengthened?
Well, one thing I've talked to some law enforcement people about is just one very specific instance, and that is what they call the wire warrant. In Vermont, what that means is putting a wire or a microphone, I guess,
right,
in lay terms, on an informant who will then go to a place where they're dealing with drugs. In Vermont, it's fairly difficult to get that wire warrant, and it's easier for the federal law enforcement to get those kind of warrants. But the other thing about that in Vermont is, if the warrant doesn't name everybody that's in the room that is being tape recorded by this informant, the people who are not named in the warrant have to be notified after the fact that they were being tape recorded. Well, and that's not a federal rule. That's, the state has that rule. As a practical matter, that's going to mean that you're not going to get informants who are willing to put a wire on them if they think somebody's going to be notified as to what they were doing. So that may be, and I will be frank with you, I have not been, I did criminal defense work for a while, but not for a long time. So I am going to rely on the experts in my office to let me know if this is something that's practical, or if there are other laws that need to be tightened up. The law enforcement experts, the prosecutors, I'm going to rely on them to help me out with that.
Yeah. Let me ask you about a related issue to the opioid epidemic, and that is a lot of people locked up as drug offenders. There's actually a nationwide push to try and reduce sentencing for nonviolent offenders, most notably people who have been put in jail for possession of illegal drugs. How do you feel about that trend? Is that something you'd support as Attorney General?
I would, in the sense that what you need to do if someone is in jail because of an addiction, not for trafficking, but because of an addiction, what you need to look at is what's most effective. And many people say that jail is not effective. Well, if it's not effective, why are we spending the money putting these people in jail, and why are we not doing something different? It's not always the case. I actually have talked to people whose children were jailed after years of rehabilitation, and that was the first time they actually became clean and sober. So what we need, again, this task force needs to look at those sentences, look at who's being incarcerated, look at the recidivism rate, and really try to do an assessment of what is the most effective way to deal with people in that situation. Now, one of the alternatives is the restorative justice programs. And I have a good friend who runs the restorative justice program in St. Johnsbury, and she raves about it, and I admire her very much, and so I take her at her word that it's very effective. So I think we need to increase those programs as an alternative to jail.
Okay. Let me ask you, and speaking of jail, a number of Vermont prisoners incarcerated out of state. Your opponent, TJ Donovan, that has been a big point of his campaign, is to try and end that practice. I don't know if you're aware, but here in our community, there's a woman of prominence whose husband is incarcerated out of state. It's been well documented what a hardship this has been on her. Your feeling, is that an issue that warrants examination? It
definitely warrants examination. However, I want to look at it a little differently. TJ Donovan has said we have to bring them back without analyzing the situation. I think that's wrong. I have done some calculations, and as a rough estimate, we're saving about $9 million a year by placing people out of state. It is hard on the families. I've had clients whose family members are being incarcerated out of state, and it is very hard. But we have, as with any organization, you have to prioritize. That $9 million savings, maybe it could be used for helping a mother who is trying to recover from addiction obtain housing so her children can stay at home with her. I don't think it's an easy black and white solution. I think it warrants a cost-benefit analysis. And so I would not say, before we investigated, that this is what we need to do.
Yeah, it needs a little bit more analysis before you say absolutely people could come back home.
Exactly.
Yeah. Wanted to ask you, we're in the political season here, and the Attorney General, speaking of ombudsman, the Attorney General's office has been sort of the arbitrator on a couple of political little bits of trickeration here by both sides lately. Brady Tensing filing a complaint with the Attorney General's office against Bernie Sanders for an email he sent out in support of Chris Pearson. You have the Democratic Party in Vermont accusing Lieutenant Governor Phil Scott of coordinating with the Republican Governors Association illegally. Right before we taped this, actually, he ruled that there was no problem there. When you hear cases like that, and those are things that as Attorney General you're going to have to deal with here, would you have ruled differently in either of those cases than Bill Sorrell did?
Well, I cannot answer that because as with any good attorney, you have to analyze the case. And I have not looked at the pleadings or looked at the facts in that case or researched the law. But what I will tell you is when those complaints come, those campaign finance complaints come, we will look at them impartially. We will look at the facts, we'll look at the law, and we'll make a decision based on that, and not on what party they're from or what political philosophy they have.
Yeah, fair enough. But how about campaign finance in general as far as how it is in the state of Vermont? Do you think that needs more clarification to avoid these sorts of complaints? Do you think it needs an overhaul?
Well, campaign finance is a very tough area because what happens is laws are made to try to limit the influence of money in politics. And then what happens is people are paid to determine how to get around those laws because money in politics is so important. You have to get the word out, and that costs money. So what I think could be a very good solution, or a partial solution, let me say, not the solution, is the influence that campaign finance has on candidates themselves. I think that's the real issue. And so if we limited, not the donors so much, but if we limited how a candidate can spend the money that they receive from contributions, that I think may help solve the money in politics problems. And here's what I mean. If we say that campaign donations can only be spent on the present campaign, cannot be spent on other candidates, which it can now, and cannot be saved for the next campaign, I think that would cause people, obviously, to only spend money on this present campaign. They would not be allowed to amass power like they do now by sprinkling their money to other candidates. Senator Leahy's a prime example. He has a $6 million war chest. He's not going to spend $6 million on a Vermont campaign. He's going to spend that money on other candidates, so that amasses power to him. And same thing with TJ Donovan. He has a huge war chest. He had a huge war chest before he even had an opponent. So what is that money going to be used for? It's going to be used either for his next campaign or to give money to other candidates so that he earns friends for his next campaign. I think that would solve at least some of the problems with campaign finance.
All right, Deb Bucknam, that's all the time we have today. A really pleasure talking to you. Thanks for coming down here to Windham County.
Well, thank you, and I would ask the voters to go to my website, bucknam2016.com, and learn more about me, and please get out the vote.
Yes, indeed. Election Day is November 8th, and we encourage you all to get out and vote. Early voting is available now if you go to your town clerk's office. And also want to encourage you that if you want to see this edition of Meet the Candidates on Brattleboro Community Television, it will be available on demand at brattleboro.tv.org, as well as our other episodes of Meet the Candidates. Thank you very much.